All right, so I'd like to talk about Father Paneloux's first sermon. Now, just by way of introduction, we have encountered Father Paneloux at the start of the story. So, if we remember, we first meet him helping Monsieur Michel, the concierge, the first person who gets the plague. And Dr. Ree runs into Father Paneloux, and Father Paneloux is assisting this man as he's stumbling. Right, he gets the plague. No one knows what it is at that time. Now, Father Paneloux is described as a learned, okay, and militant Jesuit. Okay, and so just when we think of this description, learned, that means he's erudite, he's educated, and as a Jesuit, that's consistent with the general reputation of the Jesuits. They're very educated. And then the notion of being militant, so it's more that he's driven, right? He's the sort of person who gets things done. Again, that is part of the reputation of, say, traditionally of Jesuits, right? So a Jesuit is a, a Catholic priest of the order of the Society of Jesus. So the Jesuits are sort of nickname for the order. So they're a particular kind of Catholic priest. All right, so Father Paneloux is this type uh, of priest, right? So the emphasis on Father Paneloux is that he's educated and he's this driven type of person. But again, let's not overstate that, right? He's also here in this actual circumstance helping a sick man, right? So he is, um, also has a sort of a heart to serve. Okay, now, so now let's skip ahead to the sermon itself. So the sermon is pretty much at close to when the town is first quarantined, and you know it's dawning on everyone that they're sort of stuck in this situation. They've been exiled from the world. They're caught up together. They may not see their loved ones again. They may die. Right? There's a lot of fear, and so Father Paneloux preaches a sermon, and the church is packed. It's full. And so he begins in this very powerful way. He says, "Calamity has come upon you," right? So we just note the how he speaks here. "Calamity has come upon you, my brethren, and my brethren, you deserved it." Okay, so you deserved it. Now, that may seem harsh, okay, but I think we need to look at it from his perspective and from his own particular message, right? And so he wants to do something to explain, right, this evil that has befallen them, right? So there's always a question of which why would something this bad happen, right? This is the plague. So once the plague happens, once a town gets a plague situation, then um, a number of people are going to die, right? And families are going to be ripped apart, and a lot of horrible things will happen. People will suffer and then die. And there's always the question of, well, where is God in all of this, and why is this happening, right? And so, as much as anyone might have faith in God, there's still the need for an explanation, right? Either to say, well, yeah, this is consistent with faith, or to, if in one sense that you're accusing God, then you know, then the explanation may have to be about defending God, right? So either way, and the sermon is in some way a way to explain this. Now, Father Paneloux wants to make it clear that when he says you deserved it, it is not, God is not the cause of the evil. Excuse me. Rather, God is allowing the evil to occur. Okay, so that's a distinction that we need to be careful here, that he's just careful to see. See, God is not causing this, right? But He's allowing it, right? And so, well, the question: if God's allowing it, is it possible that God could have stopped it? And I think Father Paneloux would say yes. Okay, but again, this is where the whole idea of "you deserved it" comes into play. And so, not you deserved it in a mean way, but he's going to talk about this idea that so you reap what you sow, right? So, in that sense of, um, if you do X, Y, Z, then the consequences come about, right? And that's what God is simply allowing. All right, so I'm just going to say a few things about the sermon. Just point out some things. Um, he goes through something of a history of plagues, and he says that scourges, or these sorts of plagues, are a way God uses um, these, so I'll say evil, right, to humble people, right. So you go through something like this, you take stock of your lives, you take stock of your life, and your life, you change your ways. You realize how fragile you are, or you realize you should pay more attention to things that are important, right? There's something humbling about being in the face of terrible suffering. So let me perhaps use the word suffering here. Because evil, I think, is vague. There are different kinds of evil. All right. So with suffering, suffering brings everyone to their knees, right? And then he emphasizes that the plague is not God's will, right? So that's important. Plague is not God's will, right? So it wasn't God's will that the plague happened. Okay, but what he says is that the people had taken God for granted, God's compassion for granted, and so what God has done is God has withdrawn Himself, right? So to think of it this way, as in God was protecting the people somewhat, to some degree, but now what God has done is, because the people have ignored God, God has withdrawn Himself. And so at this point, because God has withdrawn Himself, He calls this plague the evil angel that's hunting people down, right? And so people had mocked God by not taking God seriously, and now they're sort of experiencing the consequences of that, right? So it would be like, if, for instance, I fail to um, fix the brakes on my car, right? And I knew the brakes were failing. Eventually, they will fail, and I may get into a really bad accident. At that point, while no one would, certainly be happy that I'm in that accident, right? Some might tell me, well, you brought that on yourself. You should have taken care of this, right? So that's the sense in which Father Paneloux is talking about God and the plague. But he also says that this is God's manner of loving, right? So you can think of it this way, um, that he's saying, well, once we go through these types of suffering situations, we become humble and we change for the better, right? So ultimately, there's something good here that God's doing, which is He's allowing the suffering to transform us and to make us become better people, right? So He calls it God's manner of loving, right? So, and there's a sense in which one could rejoice, okay, at the suffering, right? You so in some way recognize that something good uh, may come from this. So now he then thinks of the plague as a teaching moment leading to salvation. So plague is a teaching moment, right? That leads to salvation, and he speaks of his I'll quote from the text, says, the same pestilence which is slaying you works for your good and points your path. So that's on page 98, right? So the plague, though evil, right, and even though it's suffering, it also points the path, right? So it serves, um, well, even though it's bad in itself, it's being used in some sort of good way, right? So it's almost like thinking of, uh, if you think of pain, right? let's say your arm is hurting. Now, it's hard to think of anything good about pain, but um, one good thing about pain is that when you do have pain, it's a way of actually your body notifying you that something is actually wrong with some part of your body. So we sort of take that for granted, but there's something good about pain, right? So if we didn't have experienced pain, we may not know we have broken fingers or broken ankles or, you know, a bad knee or something. So pain is a signal in some sense. Even though it's bad in itself, it can have some good aspects to it. And so I think he's talking about the plague in this sense that it points the path out, points our path, right? So I think he says that he points your path, right? So he I'm going to go ahead and read a quote on page 98 that moves on. It goes into page 99. It says, "Yet we can learn a salutary lesson. Much of it, that's the lesson, is alien to our more enlightened spirits, right? So in our day and age, we're just not used to suffering of this type, right? Um, there's something about our technological prowess that has shielded us from the harshness of our existence, right? So when in the past people would have learned to lean on God for suffering, right, we somehow tend not to, right? Because we're more enlightened now. So he says, much of it is alien to our more enlightened spirits, and yet it gives us a glimpse of that radiant eternal light which glows, a small, still flame in the dark core of human suffering. Right? So, small, still flame in the dark core of human suffering. And so, think about that, right? It's that as you're going through these, experiencing suffering, um, difficult situations, right? He is arguing in some point that there's still that small flame, there's something good that can come out of this. Okay? And he says, and this light too illuminates the shadowed paths that lead towards deliverance. It reveals the will of God in action, unfailingly transforming evil into good. Okay, so unfailingly transforming evil into good. Okay, so that's on page 99. Okay, so that's a strong statement. That's a very powerful statement, right? Essentially, he's saying whatever evil or suffering that you're experiencing, there's always that small um, flame that's flickering, right? That provides you hope, and that ultimately there's something good that can come from evil. There's always something good that can come from evil, right? Um, so he's not. So let's be clear now. He's not necessarily talking about silver lining or saying or diminishing evil or suffering. Right? He acknowledges that because it is a scourge, but he is saying that it's an opportunity, right, to look for the good, right? Look for that one spark, right, and see the one thing, good thing that can come from that. So in this case, he thinks it's the transformation of the people. And then, so I want to point out something here. He says, he tells him of something that he had been reading. So again, this goes back to this idea of him being a learned and militant Jesuit. And this is going to come up later, this idea of his experience, right? So we will look at a discussion between Jean Tarou and Dr. Rieu. And Dr. Rieu will point out something about Father Paneloux, which is that he hasn't had experience with death, right? And he says um, that a priest, right, a minister who has sat next to um, someone who's dying, who's gasping for their last breath, just would not speak about suffering in this way, right? So Camus is trying to point out something about Father Paneloux here, which is that his understanding of evil, of God, of suffering and the relation between those things is it's an understanding that's spurred by the book knowledge, so to speak. Right? It's not really based in experience, right? So when he says, I've been reading, and he says, I've studied the greatest theologians, and I can tell you what's going on here. And in fact, after the sermon, right, there was a couple of people leaving and asked, like, what did you think of the sermon? And someone said, yeah, it was perfectly logical. Like, it made sense. It was irrefutable, right? And that's really not the reaction you sort of want after a sermon. You want some sort of inspiration, some call to action. But if someone's reaction is that the logic was undeniable and it was irrefutable, right, then something's not quite right, right? And so we see Father Paneloux, his experience is more the experience of a learned, educated man, someone who has sort of learned about suffering, read it in books, who has in some way reduced it to sort of logical steps. Okay, and so he is presenting his take on evil and suffering and God in that sense. Now, couple of last quotes here. One last quote. He says that towards the end of the sermon, he hoped against hope that despite all the horrors of these dark days, despite the groans of men and women in agony, our fellow citizens would offer up to heaven that one prayer which is truly a Christian prayer, a prayer of love. Right? So he says the true Christian prayer is the prayer of love. Right? So essentially, you act in love. That's really what he's saying. So that's what it is to be Christian, to act in love. And then he says, and God, God would see to the rest. Okay, so that's interesting, right? So you can see this emphasis here on pray, right? So you have this faith, you pray to God, and you pray to God out of love, right? So I'm praying for you that you would get food to eat tonight. I'm praying that you will feel better. But then let God see to the rest, right? And so you see his notion of faith here really is very God focused, okay, and it's informed by his experience, which is primarily an experience of God that's based on theology and education, and not really an experience with people. Okay? So his faith is focused on God, and I think Camus would want to say in an abstract way. All right. So that is in a nutshell, sort of a sketch of what happens in Father Paneloux's first sermon.